How's that? Oh, you need me to say more? Hi, how are you back there? You're the sound guy, right? There you go. How's that?
Yeah. Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Sid Smith. I'm the host for this morning. Hello? Okay, that's all right. Hello to everybody again. Hello to everybody that's joining us online. We're here for the second week of a conversation about Christian nationalism, and we are privileged to have Bob Lynn with us. Last week we had Rick Ostrander with us, and he's back with us again, and we learned something about the history of Christianity in the United States, with particular emphasis on the ways in which Christian communities thought about their relationship to American culture and to the positioning of the church and belief vis-a-vis the culture. And so that was part one. We're here for part two. So let me introduce Bob. Bob Lynn is a Presbyterian pastor. He served most recently Knox Presbyterian Church here in Ann Arbor. And he was the pastor of University Adult Education and Missions for 21 years until his retirement from Knox in 2021. Prior to that, he was the director of instruction at Chesapeake Theological Seminary in or around Baltimore, right?
Yep.
And pastor of Abbott Memorial Presbyterian Church in Baltimore, Maryland. For 15 years, Bob was also a regular lecturer at the Istanbul Reformed Seminary in Turkey. He is a graduate of Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia and the Johns Hopkins University. So we are very happy to welcome you to First Presbyterian Church. What we're going to do is have Bob talk to us for maybe a half hour, then open it for questions. We're getting started at 11, so we will go at least in the lecture to 11:30, 11:35. People who have other things to do, if you have to leave at 11:30, don't worry about getting up. Just leave as you need to leave. But I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions after the presentation. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you. Sid, do you mind if I move this?
No.
Oh, okay, thank you.
No, you could.
Handling other...
Help you with that?
Tell you what,
You
let's...
want to move this which way?
Oh, I thought you
this.
wanted me here, so I can be wherever you would like me to be.
Okay, you just want to move this.
Yeah, that's all.
Okay.
Don't want to knock off someone's computer. Well, again, thank you for the kind invitation to share. I hope I can live up to the high standards that Rick set last week when he made his presentation to you. But I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that we're here together to talk about this important topic. So let's remind ourselves of what it is we're addressing this morning. Ostensibly, the topic is Christian nationalism. But really, just beneath the surface, what we're really talking about is identity, citizenship in the kingdom of God. So the title I'm giving part two of this mini-series is Whose City, Which Allegiance, Identity, Citizenship in the Kingdom of God. By way of review, let's quickly remind ourselves of what Christian nationalism is. The sociologists Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead define Christian nationalism as, quote, a cultural framework that blurs the distinction between Christian identity and American identity, viewing the two as closely related and seeking to enhance and preserve that union. And this comes from their book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. So Christian nationalism typically believes that Christians and Christian morality should have a privileged place in law, politics, and culture. It tends to see America in messianic terms as the Redeemer nation. It generally believes that the fate of the church is tied to cultural and political dominance. It sometimes views Christians as a persecuted minority, which is interesting when the latest Pew survey indicates that 62% of Americans identify as Christians. So how that makes them a persecuted minority is a puzzling one. And Christian nationalism can incline to some form of white nationalism, which sees the American way of life threatened by outsiders, Jews, minorities, and immigrants, for example. And while we can identify certain beliefs and characteristics that broadly characterize Christian nationalism, given our time constraints today, we can't consider the different varieties of it. And of course, this is all complicated by the fact that Christian nationalism, Trumpism, the MAGA movement, evangelicalism, and the Republican Party are overlapping but not concentric circles. So what is my job today? My job today is to do a bit of theological analysis. The posted class description says, quote, assess the theological merits of the movement, but I'm not sure I see any except by way of a negative analysis. To consider its influence in modern America, to consider its future prospects, and then lastly, I'm going to add a pastoral challenge. So first, some biblical and theological analysis. My central concern about Christian nationalism is the question of identity. The question of identity. Who am I? Who are you? Who are we as the people of God? Certainly this is one of the major questions the biblical story seeks to answer. Books like Exodus, Ruth, Esther, Daniel, and Revelation come immediately to mind. Important for this topic is Paul's own reflection of what it means to be in Christ. And Paul's theology of what it means to be in Christ ought to be central to our thinking about who we are and what our identity is. The cry of the exiles in Psalm 137, how can we sing the songs of Zion in a strange land, is a cry ultimately about identity. So how do we as followers of Jesus sing the songs of Zion in this strange land we call America? Now let's be clear here, we're not talking about patriotism. We're talking about nationalism. I think a lot of folks confuse patriotism and nationalism, and so they're uncomfortable with patriotism. But again, patriotism is not nationalism. Nationalism is not patriotism. As one commentator puts it, nationalism encourages us to be our worst and then tells us we are the best. Patriotism need to ignore or hide our faults and failings as a people, while at the same time loving our country, loving our common heritage, and sharing a concern for the common good. But nationalism, and particularly Christian nationalism, is simply another form of the lifeless and powerless idolatry the Bible repeatedly condemns. The historian Richard Gamble reminds us in his book, The Search for the City on a Hill, the making and unmaking of an American myth, quote, Christians ought to love their earthly home with well-ordered affections, but they must guard against idolatry in whatever form it takes. They must not give to Caesar anything that belongs to Christ and his church, no matter how much they love their country. In fact, a proper love of their country will keep them from ascribing any untruth to the thing they love. In Christian theology, it is simply not true that America is the city on a hill, not now, not ever. To seek to protect America from this falsehood is not to do her any dishonor, quite the opposite. It spares her from delusion. Proper love refuses to cooperate with the efforts to divinize America. So let's think for a moment about the question of identity as we think about Daniel in the Old Testament. He was in Babylonian culture, but he wasn't against the culture. He wasn't assimilated to the culture. He doesn't seem to have any plan to transform the culture. Rather, as a Jew in Babylon, he lived a life of negotiating competing loyalties. And as he negotiated life in Babylon, Daniel never confused or blurred or blended the distinctiveness of the nation of Babylon and the nation of Israel, the city of Babylon and the city of Jerusalem, the people of Babylon and the people of Israel. Daniel was clear about who he was. Daniel was clear about his identity. He was a son of the covenant, a descendant of Abraham, a faithful member of God's people, a servant of the God of Israel. He knew who he was and the nature of his primary allegiance. While it might be possible to think of Babylon as a patron or protector of God's people, it could never be viewed as an agent of God's redemptive purposes. Indeed, the book of Daniel reminds us that Babylon, like all earthly empires, will end up in the dustbin of history. So for example, Daniel 2:44, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. Or for another example, Daniel 7:13 and 14. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. You see, all other kingdoms will be destroyed, but the kingdom of the Son of Man will never be destroyed. Or later in chapter 7, verses 26 and 27, but the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom, again, will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. Now, I think this means we should be willing to bristle. In fact, I'd say be righteously angry when politicians from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan to Sarah Palin steal the identity of the church and give that identity to America. America is not the shining city on a hill, as politicians like to tell us. The church is the shining city on the hill. The church is the community of the kingdom that will not be destroyed and endures forever. The end of American empire is the same as the end of the Babylonian empire, the dustbin of history. And again, that's not to be negative about America, but it's to understand a biblical view of history and the place of nation states in it. And when we steal the identity of the church, it's no surprise that we also co-opt the mission of the church. And we're left with a missionary nationalism fueled by civil religion. From the colonial era to the present, we have struggled with a messianic national identity. Jonathan Edwards, speaking on Isaiah 69, said, "This prophecy," speaking about Isaiah's prophecy, "therefore seems plainly to point out America as the first fruits of that glorious day." Now, what's the glorious day of which Edwards speaks? It's the latter-day glory of the renewal of the world. And he says it begins in America. God's purpose in the end of the age begins in America. Harriet Beecher Stowe declared that the United States, quote, must be commissioned to bear the light of liberty and religion through all the earth and to bring in the millennial day. Again, that's a messianic Redeemer nation identity. Lincoln asserted that our creed of liberty is the hope for the world for all future time, or as George Bush put it, the hope of mankind. We've come to believe that we have an obligation to carry the creed of liberty and the institutions that support it to the world. Think of the dollar bills in your pocket. If in our increasingly cashless society you even have dollar bills in your pocket anymore. I haven't carried cash in ages. But if you had a dollar bill in your pocket, on the back of each one is a motto. And what's the motto? Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. But the Bible reminds us that the only new order of things is the one issued or ushered in by Jesus' resurrection. Whether Egypt, Babylon, Rome, or America, the empires and the nations of the earth are part of the old order of things which is passing away, part of this present evil age from which, as Galatians remind us, we as followers of Jesus have been delivered. In this world, we are, as Peter tells us in his first letter, exiles. We're exiles in this world. Or think of Hebrews 11. It reminds us that we're like patriarchs. By faith, he, Abraham, made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. You see, he lived even in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived symbolically in tents, as did his sons Isaac and Jacob. They understood who they were and what their identity was, and the nature of God's purposes for his world. Ephesians 2:19, consequently, he says to these Gentiles, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. That's why in Philippians 3:20, Paul says our citizenship is in heaven. Think of Philippi, that ancient city. Philippi was a colony of Rome, and so its citizens were granted Roman citizenship with all the rights and privileges granted to any citizen born in Rome. Philippi was governed as if it was Italian soil. The church is, Paul says, a colony of heaven with its members enjoying the full citizenship of the heavenly city. Its life reflects its connection to the heavenly Zion. It is governed as if it were, so to speak, heavenly soil. If you've ever been to Embassy Row in Washington, D.C. on Massachusetts Avenue, step into any embassy. Step into, for example, the French embassy. As soon as you cross the threshold into the French embassy, you're not on American soil anymore, you're on French soil. You see, and so when you step into the church, you're not in soil that is part of this present evil age, not part of this order of things, but part of God's new age and the new order of things as we come into the fellowship and the life of God's people. You see, this should remind us that identifying the church with either the progressive left or the conservative right, with the Democratic or the Republican Party, is a major failure with respect to understanding our fundamental identity as citizens of another commonwealth, a heavenly commonwealth. Our identity as Jesus followers relativizes all our relationships, whether biological, social, cultural, or political. And so, therefore, in this world, as Hart reminds us, we will always have a hyphenated existence. And so I, for example, will always be an American Christian or a Christian American. And there are tensions in that hyphenated existence. And I will always be negotiating and competing, I will always be negotiating the competing loyalties involved in being of this place but not of it. And so is true of all of you. Augustine captures the tensions well as he summarizes the heartbeat of the two cities we inhabit. Now, this is from City of God, Book 14, Chapter 28. He says, "We see then that the two cities were created by two kinds of love. The earthly city was created by self-love, reaching the point of contempt for God. The heavenly city by the love of God, carried as far as contempt of self. In fact, the earthly city glories in itself. The heavenly city glories in the Lord. The former looks for glory from men. The latter finds its highest glory in God. The earthly lifts up its head in its own glory. The heavenly city says to its God, 'My glory, you lift up my head.' In the former, the lust for domination lords it over its princes as over the nations it subjugates. In the other, both those in authority and those subject to them serve one another in love, the rulers by their counsel, the subjects by their obedience. The one city loves its own strength, shown in its powerful leaders. The other says to God, 'I will love you, my Lord and my strength.'" See, understanding those competing loyalties, those fundamental commitments that shape each city, ultimately, in the end, remind us that our primary allegiance, our ultimate allegiance, is to only one city, which helps us to see the centrality of that earliest and most fundamental Christian confession. Kyrios Iesu, Jesus is Lord. And if Jesus is Lord, therefore what? Caesar is not. Again, the only way to deal with the tensions and negotiate the competing loyalties is if we know most fundamentally who we are, and most importantly, whose we are. We can never be at home in a city governed by the libido dominante, as Augustine put it, the lust for power, earthly power, cultural power, political power. We live in this earthly city, but we are citizens of the heavenly city. And I think if we apply the argument of the book of Galatians to our discussion today, we come to recognize that wrapping God in an American flag and making him the national mascot is a fundamental denial of the resurrection of Jesus and the dawning in history of God's new future, of which we, as his people, are a part. Paul saw the threat of an ethnocentric covenantal theology as a lethal threat to the global mission of the gospel and the identity of the church, deserving nothing less than a scathing apostolic anathema, as we see him doing in chapter 1. Paul says the gospel could never become good news, you can become Jewish. But likewise, a covenantal theology wrapped in the cultural markers of any race, any ethnicity, any nation, any culture, any ideology is a threat to the global mission of the church and a distortion of our identity, equally deserving an apostolic anathema. Okay, so a sort of breathless bit of theological analysis, but then I'm also asked to address the question, what is the influence of Christian nationalism in modern America? Well, the best estimates of that are that 10% of American people identify as Christian nationalists of one sort or another. Now, my gut, and again, I'm telling you my gut, I don't have a word from God here. My gut says that while Christian nationalism has the potential to create discomfort that ranges from heartburn to heartbreak, I'm not sure it's able to have much lasting influence. And I say heartbreak because it is such a fundamental betrayal of the gospel and Christian identity. And in betraying their identity, Christian nationalists demonstrate a lost confidence in the power of the gospel, which is God's way, God's means for rescuing a runaway planet. Selling your birthright for a bowl of someone else's stew never turns out well. As the commentator Jack Meador notes, it's becoming increasingly clear that evangelical Trump voters are, by and large, not abandoning Trump's GOP for any reason. This their views and policy priorities can simply be ignored by the real leaders of the current GOP because there is no reason to concede anything to people whose vote you will have no matter what. In other words, the Christian influence on actual Republican policy items and their political vision is going to be exceedingly negligible going forward. So, for example, it strikes me that Trump's attacks on the rule of law betrays not a Christian influence, and I don't use this word lightly, but a pagan one. It's a pagan worship of power. It has nothing to do with the power of the gospel. And this should come as no surprise to us as descendants of the Scottish Presbyterian minister Samuel Rutherford, who in 1644 wrote the book Rex Lex, The Law is King, a defense of the rule of law. Our power as God's people is not political power or cultural power. Paul understood he had a message that would change the world, but he never clamored to be photographed with Nero in Nero's office. He didn't seek to change Roman culture through winning the culture wars. For Paul and for us, the power of God is the way of the cross. When Paul identifies the Philippians as citizens of another kingdom, he's calling them as well to a new way of life grounded in that kingdom. Jesus came in suffering love, self-giving love for the sake of the world. That is the power of God, which is foolishness for the world. The path to sharing in Jesus' glory, Paul reminds us, is in his suffering. We're Presbyterians. We believe in the doctrine of election. But elected for what? Chosen to what? To know we're invited to the party and others aren't? No, we're chosen to suffer and die in the upside-down way of the kingdom, following Jesus who trod that road first. Philippians 1:29, for it has been granted to you, and he uses the word charis there, grace. It's been gifted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. Or Romans 8:29, for those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, who is the suffering servant. God's call to you and to me is to be conformed to the image, not of the powerful, but the suffering servant. As Kierkegaard put it, what is the New Testament? It's a handbook for those who are to be sacrificed. Now, its future prospects. Well, frankly, without a crystal ball or the prophetic gifts of Isaiah or Jeremiah, I think the prospects of Christian nationalism are hard to predict. I think some form or another of Christian nationalism will likely be around for some time to come. Now, why do I say that? Because some form or another of Christian nationalism has been with us since the founding of the Republic. I could recommend different books here, but I'll just recommend one, Penn Professor Walter McDougall's book, The Tragedy of U.S. Foreign Policy, How America's Civil Religion Betrayed the National Interest. It's a story that he starts with Adams and Jefferson, not Ronald Reagan and Jerry Falwell. In the mid-19th century, the Union and the Confederacy both waged total war because each was convinced that God was squarely on their side. We entered the 20th century with a heady mix of messianic nationalism and progressive religion. We entered the 21st century with a heady mix of messianic nationalism and conservative religion. So I think any way you look at it, a form of Christian nationalism has been with us for a while, and likely will be in the years to come. So lastly, in my final few minutes, a pastoral challenge. Okay, so like the Pharisee in Jesus' parable, we can all now go home saying, thank God I'm not like those people. Is that the takeaway here today? No, I don't think so. And your laughter says you agree. We've thought about the fact of some of our neighbors, but we need to spend a bit of time thinking about the why of some of our neighbors and what our response needs to be. Why do 30 million people find themselves drawn to some form of Christian nationalism? Why do more perhaps find themselves to some degree in secret sympathy with them? And it might even be that you know some of them. Maybe not, but perhaps you do. And I think there are likely a number of reasons, but let's consider at least one. And the one that I think we could focus on today is anger. Anger. Anger at being cut out, anger at being left behind, anger at being excluded. Excluded politically, excluded socially, excluded economically, excluded religiously. In a recent New York Times op-ed piece, Brian Goldstone, author of There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America, wrote, "At 10 p.m., a hospital technician pulls into a Walmart parking lot. Her 4 kids, one still nursing, are packed into the back of her Toyota. She tells them it's an adventure, but she's terrified someone will call the police. Inadequate housing is enough to lose your children. She stays awake for hours, lavender scrubs folded into the trunk, listening for footsteps, any sign of trouble. Her shift starts soon. She'll walk into the hospital exhausted, pretending everything is fine." How angry might you be to be among the working homeless? Did you live in a world that says hard work leads to stability? Isn't the myth of our meritocracy true? David Brooks, in his recent book, How to Know a Person, relates the story of, and I'm quoting here now, a 70-year-old working class man in South Dakota who, by the way, earlier is identified as a Trump supporter. A 70-year-old working class man in South Dakota who told me about the best day of his life. It happened when he was 34 and he was laid off as a foreman because they had upgraded the equipment and he was no longer skilled enough to do the job. He thought he was just going to leave quietly. He packed his stuff into a box, opened his office door, and found the entire workforce, 3,500 people, had formed a double line from his office door to his car in the parking lot. He walked down the line as they applauded and cheered him. He told me that every job he has had in the 36 years since has been worse, and that he and his wife have slid closer and closer to poverty. How angry might you be if the only story of your life you had to tell was the story of a downward sloping life? And perhaps we can all agree that in a First Amendment culture, Christian nationalism has no place. I think that's a given. But what about the exclusion of thoughtful, respectful Christian participation and activism in the political process? Indeed, what about the exclusion of thoughtful, respectful participation and activism for those who inhabit any number of religious traditions? How frustrated might you be having been excluded from being part of the public conversation, being told that your religion is fine for your private life, but has no place in the public square? That is, of course, unless you lean left and embrace the Democratic platform. Yale historian Timothy Snyder says that empathy is the only way to be a reasonable person. Empathy is the only way to be a reasonable person. What does it mean from the comfort of a world made to work for us? And I underline us, given the demographic at this church and my own life history. I don't worry about the price of eggs, never have and probably never will. Or the price of anything else. See, the world works for me. It works for you, but it doesn't work for a lot of people. What does it mean to have empathy for those for whom the world doesn't work? Empathy doesn't necessarily mean agreement. It doesn't mean validation. It doesn't mean legitimation. But looking down our noses at the deplorables over fly country who angrily cling to their guns and religion while we self-righteously declare ourselves on the right side of history is just no way to begin a conversation for better understanding. It make us feel good, but it fails to win over the mother living in her car with 4 children. Empathy means listening. Empathy means understanding. Empathy means trying to imagine what it means to live in someone else's world and walk in someone else's shoes. Empathy may even lead us to may even lead to understanding, and understanding may lead to change, perhaps on both sides. So to conclude, how do we sing the Lord's songs in a strange land? One, by acknowledging that in the end America is and always will be a land strange to us as God's people. Two, by remembering the first song we sing as its citizens is the Star-Spangled Banner, or America the Beautiful, but the old gospel song, we're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. And three, from that position, asking what it means politically, socially, and culturally to do justice, to act mercifully, and to walk humbly with our God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. If some people need to leave now for some of their activity in the church, feel free to go out. I know you'll take questions.
Yeah, oh, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give everybody who asked the question this, so people online can hear you. That's why we ask you to use the microphone. So, yeah.
So first, Bob, what a wonderful lecture. I've been to school. I have a question just building off the last point about empathy. Given your experience, around the world and locally with different churches, and a desire to build a collective capability for empathy, especially at this time. Have you seen or could you imagine kind of things that might help churches, broadly defined, to lift up the collective capacity for empathy?
Good question. I think you can do that in at least a couple of ways. First is just having a congregation that is deeply salted by the gospel. And I know that sounds like a quaint maxim that, ought to be on a Hallmark greeting card, and, there he goes, he's banal again. But I'm surprised at how much, there's a professor at the University of Michigan, or he was there, who had a book, I think it was James Turner, No God, No Creed, and he says it wasn't the atheists that killed God, it was his friends. It was his friends, by moralizing and psychologizing the gospel. And we need more than moral uplift or psychological tips. We need to learn about a new order of things, a new future, a new age in which Jesus is king and we are his subjects, and we're the objects of his love purchased by his blood, and his people who are called to serve him in his mission in the world. So when you've got that sort of big historical gospel, what does it mean to salt a congregation with that? Okay, and that's an indirect thing. It comes in sermons and in liturgy and all sorts of ways where you just get gospel. And when you're told time after time, you start to believe what you hear, right? But I also think you can teach about it. I remember at our own church a few years back, we had a sort of everybody in the worship center, every adult invited Sunday school class. Our church, we tended to have 5 or 6 classes, and they always sort of, they were elective system. No, this is important. We want everybody in the worship center for adult ed this semester, because we're going to talk about how to have good conversations. But a good conversation is more than just, well, I got out of that one safely. But really good conversation for better understanding. There's a book, a friend of mine, Fred Bailey, he's a master at this. He's digested the book, How to Have a Better Conversation. What would it mean to have a Sunday school class on how to have a better conversation? Because better conversations always lead to understanding. So, there's a couple of tips for you. Yeah.
Could I follow up with a question on empathy? There's a strand now in the nationalist and Christian / nationalist zone or
Yeah.
zeitgeist that's coming down hard on empathy, that's calling it the work of the devil. I don't know whether you've heard that from some of the. So empathy, and I think it has to do with the feminization of empathy as soft and fuzzy and not muscular, and the call for muscular Christianity, and away from being empathetic in terms of one's relationship with other people.
Yeah.
What do you see happening in that strand of Christian nationalism?
Well, and again, I use the word because Timothy Snyder used the word. So it's not a sacred word. It's not a word you have to use. So that's the first thing. There are other words you can put in its place. Second thing is, sort of like Pilgrim, when you hear people say that, just put your fingers in your ears, run away and yell, life, life, eternal life. You were supposed to laugh at that. Oh my gosh. But literally just stop listening, right? Because it's wrong, because again, think of the fruit of the Spirit. Love, gentleness, faithfulness, kindness. I mean, okay, use those words if you don't like the word empathy. Use biblical words. Empathy is not a biblical word, but it's a good word, right? It means not just hearing you factually, but it means imagining what it must be like to have that experience. It engages or wants us to engage our imaginative capacity. So I think words like kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self, all the words of the fruit of the Spirit, I mean, ask us to engage our moral imaginative capacity. So whatever word, but I mean, really seriously, just plug up your ears and stop listening, because I think you're right. It's this new masculinity that's kind of toxic out there, and so my guess is you're right. It appears too soft, but oh well. That's their problem, not ours.
Okay, other questions? Yeah.
This is more of a comment than a question. Concerning the masculinity, I think our target is to look at Jesus. And Jesus did not promote his masculinity, his power over people. He was always the one to forgive, and gentleness and kindness. So I think the real answer to this masculinity thing is look at the source, Jesus Christ.
Do you want me to respond, or are you just making a comment?
I'm happy to have you respond.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, the Bible doesn't seem to give a lot of attention to issue of sexuality, male or female. It does address it, but not in the ways that are sort of currently in play. And so, as when I was a pastor, I would have, I don't know how many college students, female college students, come to me and say, but how do I find a real Christian man? Right? And the emphasis always tended to be on man, right? There's this ideal of manhood they were looking for, and what I would respond to say, well, what kind of a follower of Jesus is he? And if in his manhood you see him following Jesus, man, go for it, right? It wasn't about testosterone or a resistance to being empathetic. It was about what's the quality of his Christian life? What's the quality of his relationship with Jesus? In what ways is he a disciple of Jesus that you could emulate? Look for that kind of guy. Does that help? Okay.
Thanks so much for your talk today. Can you guys hear me okay in this? It was awesome. I grew up from an Anabaptist background until I married my lovely Presbyterian wife. And everything that you were saying really resonates with sort of that deeply held suspicion of the structures of authority that comes from an Anabaptist background, where we're taught that the true fall of the church was Emperor Constantine creating the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
I'm just wondering, what your thoughts are on that sort of point of view. Is it consistent with the Presbyterian point of view? It seems like that could be something that, but I was just wondering. I love your reflection on that.
Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing is, so what were they going to do? Tell him he couldn't become a Christian? Right. So, I mean, there is a sense in which, as Christian faith makes progress in its sort of take no prisoners fashion, when the emperor commits himself to following Jesus, and then he says, so what would a Christian emperor do? I don't know what the way around that is. Okay, so that's the first thing. I'm not super sympathetic with sort of pinning it all on Constantine's shoulders. You know, he just shouldn't have become a Christian. But I would say Reformed theology and Anabaptist theology meet in a glorious way in the theologian Leslie Newbigin. So if you read Leslie Newbigin's books, you get this thoroughly incorporated appreciation of Anabaptism within a framework of Reformed theology. So they aren't oil and water. I think they can go together very nicely. Even while I love Stanley Hauerwas, but I wouldn't agree with everything with Stanley Hauerwas, but I would say I've been influenced by Stanley Hauerwas, and he fits within my Reformed framework really well. So, yay for you. You now inhabit both worlds. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on Christian's question, and because it seemed to me when I was hearing you talk, like he sounds very Anabaptist for a Presbyterian here. So, I guess my general question is, I agree with your distinction between city of God and city of man, and we are citizens of heaven. Throughout, many American Christians have invested a lot of time and energy to actually building and creating institutions that have cultural power, but cultural power for good, and trying to have a redemptive influence in this world, in this country.
Right, yeah.
So I guess I'd like to hear you speak a little bit to what is the role, given that we live in a fallen world and our citizenship is in heaven,
Yeah.
Is there still room for deep investment in this culture, in institutions that will impact our culture?
Yeah. I recognize as I was writing that this question was likely going to come up, and I was hoping it wouldn't. So thanks for that. Absolutely. In other words, the big asterisk that ought to have accompanied this, that led us then to a whole nother discussion, was, so does this mean we opt out? No, it doesn't mean that we opt out. In other words, we're still citizens of both cities. And so what does it mean to be a good American citizen, for example? And maybe not all of you here are American citizens, but for those of us who are, but even for those of you who are not, we're to seek the common good of this land together. So again, I think in that place where I argued for a true plurality, not pluralism. See, pluralism is an ideology, plurality is a sociological reality, which says we all come from different places, we all come with different, as Charles Taylor would call it, social imaginaries. Worldview is out of vogue these days. We all come with different religious commitments, and so how do we all sit down at the table together and bring our gifts together for the common good of our land, and then as Christians hoping, for example, Rodney Stark in his book talks about how the Christian influence over time ended those brutal Roman games. And he says, to a culture that wanted to rob people of their humanity, Christians gave them back their humanity. So Christians can make remarkable gifts in our culture. But given my lens of just Christian nationalism, wanting to say, I need to shoot that out of the sky, right, as maybe you did last week, without the ability in 3 more classes to say, so positively, what does this mean? But I agree with you 100%. Yeah, Christians ought to be in the arena. But as Christians, not as neutral observers or neutral participants, because I think we all know there's no such thing as neutrality. Do we agree? Then why have we based our public life on the idea of neutrality when it doesn't exist? It's because the neutrality isn't really neutrality at all. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation.
Other questions?
They're all saying, wait, we got brunch reservations.
So, in this troubled time, at least I'm experiencing is really troubled. Like, what are you reading to keep you grounded? I mean, this is not really about your talk.
Yeah, oh yeah.
But, you know, I imagine since you cited so many books, you're a wonderful reader of books. But in terms of, you know, contemporary times, like trying to understand the conversations and the debates, I'm to the point where I don't know what to read to believe.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not at all related to what you're talking about, but you're a wise man with a lot of experience, and I just would be curious about that.
Well, I maybe this sounds like a cop-out, but first thing, and maybe in light of our time, the only thing I'd advise you would be is to not to wallow in the sewer.
Say that again?
Not to wallow in the sewer.
Oh,
In other words, reading about all this, I mean, I know someone, it's an obsession. There's no end to it, right? And so what that does is it brings down our sights, it sours our spirits, it makes us feel discouraged and defeated. And so, you know, I'm reading more novels than ever these days. No, seriously, I am. Because I realize how flat I am emotionally. And so novels are helping me round out my soul. But I don't spend a lot of time, like Stanley Hauerwas, I'm reading the Duke Stanley Hauerwas reader right now. That book is 30 years old. Now I'm making some imaginative applications, but I mean I'm not reading somebody who's telling me about this moment. I kind of gloss over the New York Times every day really quickly. I gloss over the Washington Post. And that's about it for current news, because it's, see, I think part of the strategy is to throw out 2 or 3 outrages a day so that you'll be so outraged you won't really notice what they're doing. See, and so you need to stay more focused to say, well, what's important, not the day, or the 7 daily outrages, right? You know, I don't know how they come up with it so quickly. It's very, very imaginative. Okay, or the Christian nationalists. I mean, you know, you start. There's the 7 mountain variety, and and I think, do these people not have jobs, right? But so anyway, so I would say, stay above the fray quite a bit, and find things again that will feed your soul. Read novels, read good books about Jesus, read good books about his kingdom. Now, I don't know if this is true, but the myth is that bank tellers are taught to identify the counterfeit by studying the real. They don't study counterfeit bills, they study real bills, so they know a counterfeit when they see it. So I'd say your reading ought to spend more time with the real than the counterfeit. I don't know if that helps.
I just want to put a plug in here for the humanities, because it's very wonderful that you talked about the depth of engagement with the complexities of reality by reading powerful books, powerful creative, powerful poetry, powerful, so that the mind is expanding and one is transported to other worlds. So anyway, I'm in the humanities, and the humanities is under assault, as we know. So it was really nice to have that comment about moving to different kinds of registers of what's going on in the world, and what we can do about what's going on. I'm sorry, that's crass plug for a certain corner of the university. Anything else? We want to thank you so much for coming. I have a gift for you.